John Hook's Newsmaker Saturday starts now.
Thanks for joining us for Newsmaker Saturday. Just in my humble opinion, there may not be a bigger issue in the state now than water. We are stretched, and it could get worse. 700 years ago, the Hohokams who settled the valley were extinguished because of a 20-year mega drought that dried up the Salt River and ended their lifeline. Now, we know this because of tree rings. Very clever that they can figure this out. Arizona is now in the midst, currently, in a 22-year drought. Tremendous planning, engineering, and banked water has bought us some time. But if the dry years continue for much longer, we are potentially looking at some pretty dramatic cuts. Chuck Podolak is the Director of Water Rights and Contracts for Salt River Project. He's our guest on Newsmaker Saturday. Thanks for joining us, Chuck. We appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Our forefathers did a great job of setting this up. I mean, there are a lot of places that have worse water situations than we have, and they're not nearly as arid as we are. Can you run through, when you turn on the tap, where that water's coming from?
Absolutely. When you think about it from the greater Phoenix area, that water's coming really from one of two places. About half of Phoenix gets our water from within state. And so this is water that's coming from the Arizona mountains. Think Williams, Flagstaff, all the way over to Greer. All the rain and snow that accumulates in there, it runs down the Salt and the Verde rivers. It runs into the series of reservoirs out north and east of Phoenix, and it's delivered through the Salt River Project, or SRP. About the other half of the greater Phoenix area water comes from a mix, but primarily from the Colorado River. So think of the high Rockies from Wyoming over into Colorado, coming down the Colorado through Lake Powell, through Lake Mead, and it's brought into Central Arizona through the Central Arizona Project, or CAP canals, and delivered to the Phoenix area. So it really depends on what part of town you live in when you turn on that tap. Is that water originating in the upper Colorado Rockies, or is that water originating up in the Central Arizona mountains?
Okay, so our issue right now is with the Colorado, the CAP. Lake Mead, we've seen the pictures, the bathtub ring, the whole bit. It's down, 100 feet or so from dead pool status, where it could no longer turn the turbines for generating electricity. So it's pretty serious. On the series of dams and 7 lakes that make up SRP's water flow through the salt, that's a lot better off right now, correct?
Yes, it is. It's, we're still in the midst of a long-term drought here in Arizona, but the Salt River Project water supplies have been faring fairly well. Right now, we're sitting at about 66% full, which may not sound a lot, but in the midst of a 20-year drought, that is really a remarkable accomplishment. So for those of us who are relying on water from Roosevelt Lake and the other reservoirs, you're sitting in a pretty good spot with regards to the Salt River Project system.
Okay, with regards to the Colorado, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the commissioner wants the Colorado River Basin states to conserve an additional roughly 2.5 million acre-feet of water by 2023. That could result in additional cutbacks. Would that, in your view, Chuck, be a game changer where potentially no more lawns? What would be in play at that point?
I think right now everything's in play, and that means there's contribution from a variety of water users across the basin. I think we're not talking about putting that entire burden on cities. We're not talking about putting that entire burden on outdoor landscaping. We're not talking about putting that burden on tribal communities. We're not talking about putting that burden completely on agriculture. But we're looking for contributions from throughout the 7 states that make up the Colorado River Basin and Mexico. And we're looking for contributions or participation from across the board, from municipal users, from residential users, from agriculture. The impacts are going to depend on how we come together and develop a plan to come up with that number, and whether we truly do share that burden across a variety of states and a variety of users.
Okay, let's talk first about the fact that agriculture is the big user. That's 72% roughly of all of our water we use.
Yes, roughly. I think that's aggregated across the western U.S., but it's somewhere in that 70% in most of the western states.
Okay, and we need to continue to grow. This is some of the best growing area in the country. So you don't want to kind of gut agriculture in the process of saving water. But I spoke to a gentleman last week who studied the situation in Israel, And he's a big advocate of this idea that maybe we can start to use drip irrigation in agriculture to save water like they've done in Israel.
Yes, I think that is important to afford farmers the opportunity to use the water to the best they can and to the most efficient. Now, drip irrigation is not the solution everywhere. The soil, the where the water is, what works in Yuma may not work in Casa Grande and vice versa. And so I think it's important for us to make sure farmers have the resources to put the water to the best use, the most efficient use they can. And they're businessmen. They want to use the resource and the ability to grow their crops in the best use possible. So I think we want to acknowledge all the work that's gone into agricultural efficiency. And we've really seen that grow by leaps and bounds, particularly in Western Arizona. When you go down and look in the Yuma area, I'd encourage people to go down there and look at the farms. And it's really phenomenal what they're able to do with a given amount of water down there.
One of the surprising things, Chuck, is that even though we've grown by 500,000 people, we're using the same amount of water that we used 20 years ago in Arizona. That's just, people, when they hear that, they go, that can't be right. But it is. Part of it is you're trading ag land, which uses heavy use of water, for residential, which uses far less.
Absolutely. And that's really been the story of the greater Phoenix area. We grew up, the recent history of Phoenix has been agriculture. We were a community of farmers, and over time, as more people have moved and the economy and people's desires have changed in the Phoenix area, those farmers have seen it beneficial to sell their farmland, to move farming elsewhere in the state, and to have those farms turn into houses. And that's how we've gotten to such a resilient supply for the parts of the valley that's served by the Salt River Project. And
Let's
so
talk
that voluntary conversion from agriculture to land to houses is really what has set the foundation for the resiliency in a lot of Phoenix.
These droughts that we're experiencing right now, we have had them over history many times. This is not unique territory. Even people think this has never happened before. It's unprecedented. It's actually happened a bunch historically, going back thousands of years. The question is anybody modeling that we might just come out of the cycle and get into a wet period like we were in the 70s and 80s? I mean, when the Salt River was flooding routinely, you were maybe around during that. I certainly was. It was unbelievable.
Yes, we absolutely do see. What we're seeing right now is the impact of climate change. We're seeing shifting climate. We're seeing shifting precipitation patterns. But we're seeing one part of that. And what we see, SRP has done research on our own. We've done that in close partnership with Arizona State University and other state universities, as well as several government agencies. And what it tells us for climate change on the Salt River Project watershed and the Salt and Verde rivers is we are going to see more prolonged droughts, but we're also going to see more wet periods. And when you look at what the climate change research is showing for the Colorado River Basin up in the Upper Rockies, they're seeing the same thing. You're going to see longer dry periods, but you're also going to see some periods of very prolonged wet times. And that tells us we need those reservoirs.
So how do we capture that? How do we capture that water?
Yeah.
For instance, California, the debate out there is that they won't build any dams. They've got plenty of water, but they're always in a shortage because they won't build dams to capture it.
And unfortunately, we're in a good situation, particularly with the Salt River Project. We have a lot of storage in Roosevelt Dam, and that is a large reservoir that can get us through very prolonged drought periods, and it can catch those rainy periods. And the current work that SRP is doing in conjunction with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and 20 other partners, looking at Bartlett Dam and potential modifications to Bartlett Dam, John, is exactly around that question of, do we have the storage, or can we put more storage on so when we do get those wet years, we can capture that water and we can move that to where it's needed in Arizona.
Okay,
so
let's talk about let's talk about innovation in the last. We've got about a minute and a half. Innovation. We are banking water. Can you explain briefly? We're banking a bunch of water underground in the aquifers. Yes. It's a brilliant plan. Is that water, number one, safe? Is it chemical free, or do we have problems with that? And what are we doing with that water?
No, so the first question is very safe. These storage facilities are all permitted by the Arizona Department of Water Resources, and they're governed by the water quality is governed by the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. And so we're adhering to all those laws and regulations when we put the water down there and when we take it out. And we are, when it comes time to face shortages and when municipalities face time to take cuts off the Colorado River, we will start to turn to those supplies. Now, those are not designed to live on forever, but those are designed as a savings account to get us through some of those tight times. And tight times are coming on the Colorado River. So I would expect that we will continue to work with cities and other entities around the state to recover some of that stored water to get us through these tight times.
One more before we let you go. This idea of desalination, the governor has talked about it, money's being used toward it. Is this a way out for us?
It's not a way out, but it's a way forward. I think what we saw innovations like the development of the Salt River Project. We saw innovations like the delivery of the Central Arizona Project. And I do believe that we will continue to work with Mexico, with the Republic of Mexico, on desal projects that will bring a new water supply to Arizona. It won't be cheap, it won't be right away, but in the future, we will be bringing water desalinated from Mexico.
It's fascinating. Chuck Podolak, Director of Water Rights and Contracts for SRP. We sure appreciate your time. It's great to see you.
Thank you, John. Nice to see you.
Let's hope it rains.
Absolutely.
Chuck, thank you. When we come back on Newsmaker Saturday, Charles Lipson, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and kind of on the state of politics in our country, still ahead on Newsmaker Saturday. Professor Emeritus of Political Science at University of Chicago, Charles Lipson, last week penned an op-ed in Real Clear Politics that caught my eye, entitled November 3, January 6, and the Mounting Threats to Democracy. He argues in this op-ed that Republicans and Democrats' actions breaking norms and traditions of governance, quoting here, imperils the most important outcome of all, a stable constitutional democracy. Charles Lipson joins us now from Chicago. Thank you for pinning the article, first of all. I loved it, and I thought you hit a home run with it, because anybody who's just fair-minded and is watching what's happening, I don't think they like what they're seeing right now in our country. There's a lot of trouble. I mean, we've been through tougher times, as you know. Obviously, Civil War, 1968, Civil Rights Movement, upheaval, Watergate, Vietnam War. Where are we kind of in that continuum, do you think?
Well, let me go back to the 60s since you referenced them. I was in college in the late 60s. In fact, when I graduated, there were armed National Guard standing outside my dorm room. I don't think they had me specifically in mind, but these were kids my age, you know, they were as nervous as I was, but there had been so many riots. And what struck me in the early 70s was how quickly it all calmed down. How all that, I mean, there had been assassinations.
Yes.
President Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. You know, it was a violent time. There had been massive riots and everything. And then it all calmed down. And that made me think that this is an essentially very stable country. But I'm very worried now because it doesn't seem like the divisions are about one or two issues. They seem to be about every issue, and we seem to be cutting the pie the same way each time. That is, if you tell me what your position is on issue 1, I can probably, or certainly if it's on issue 1 and 2, I can probably predict what it is on 3, 4, and 5. And that's led to a very divided country. And it's also more ideological, I think, than American politics has been for a long, long time.
Charles, what do you think is driving that? Is it the media kind of, we've got everybody in their own corners and they've got their own echo chamber where their views and thoughts and feelings can be reinforced on a daily, nightly basis?
Don't you think that that's a big part of it?
I do.
I mean, it's the siloing of America. We may not be in the rural country much anymore, but we're certainly in media silos. And what people look for is social scientists call it confirmation bias. You're looking for media that tells you your thoughts are correct. and you don't want to hear a dissenting voice. And that's been a really troubling part of modern university life, has been the silencing of speech and what ought to be a very open and free discourse where challenging ideas come up. But I noticed at Cornell this week, somebody objected to a bust of Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, which they had in the library, and they were removed. I mean, so I just see this kind of constant complaining. And I must say, the attacks on our country, often by people within the country, people who are protesting and so forth, don't look like friendly criticism. They look like mean-spirited, this is a bad country, I'm embarrassed to live here kind of criticism. And then people who feel patriotic feel like pushing back against that.
Let me throw up one of the from your article that caught my attention. And this goes back to where we are with this January 6th stuff, the committee. Let's put up number one here. You said, unfortunately, a large majority of Republican voters still believe that his repeated assertion of the election, Mr. Trump we're talking about, was stolen. He is still making that assertion and providing, without providing credible evidence, much less evidence that would convince a neutral court. The former president looks back in anger and refuses to endorse any Republican candidates who don't publicly endorse his position. You start with culpability on President Trump's part, but then you start to spread the wealth around a little bit, saying that both sides are making mistakes.
Right. Let me say something about the stolen election. There's no evidence it was stolen. And of course, people in Arizona have followed this very closely because it was one of the sites that was alleged to be stacked with false votes. And there was all the stuff in Maricopa County recounting the votes and all the rest. And there's no evidence that votes were miscounted in any large numbers, and Bill Barr had all of this correct. But I do think that when people say it was a stolen election, I think some people mean that the ballots were miscounted and so forth, and that's wrong. But I think other people mean that the media bias was so intense and the big money was so against Trump that the election was in some sense rigged, even though all those actions were legal. And I think they do have a kind of a
so that's
case.
That's become an umbrella term in your view,
right?
That it's not literally stolen, but that the deck was stacked against President Trump.
I think there's no question that that's true. But going to your point in your earlier question, what we see now from the Democrats about stacking the court, packing the court, which started, of course, with Franklin Roosevelt and breaking the filibuster and so forth, going to all the special ways of voting which make fraud more likely, but which were necessary during a pandemic shutdown, and making all of those permanent, and then saying that certain kind of reasonable restrictions like voter ID are Jim Crow racism and take us back to the 1930s and sharecropping and so forth. All of that is an attack on our norms and the integrity of the vote and the integrity of congressional procedures as well. I must say, though, I was really troubled by the latest January 6th hearings. The discussion of Trump's behavior was extremely troubling.
Well, yes, and I think even reasonable people can say, that feels over the top. Even though as we're taping today on Wednesday, that some of this is being challenged by the Secret Service and people who were there. Some of the behavior in the Beast, the president's car.
That's right. By the way, that's a problem. Because the committee itself is so stacked, nobody really cross-examined that witness or any others.
No,
They're
you
all
talk about that. You talk about that in the op-ed. You say that the way this was put together is kind of a kangaroo court. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're saying that Nancy Pelosi, there's 2 Republicans on there, but she handpicked them.
That's
so
correct.
This kind of breaks with tradition on how these hearings are handled. And your supposition is that that also undermines the process.
Yes, every time you break rule one, it makes it easier for somebody else to break rule two. And I think almost everybody, when I talk to them, Republican or Democrat, justifies the rule breaking as a retaliation or as a reasonable response to what the other side did. Harry Reid changed the rules for getting judges through in order to get Barack Obama's judges through. He didn't extend it to the Supreme Court, though there was no reason why it shouldn't have been. But I mean, he broke the rules. And then what happens when the Republicans are in the majority? They use Harry Reid's rules, apply them to the Supreme Court, and that's how Trump got his 3 appointments through. So each time you change the rules for one side, it's going to be changed for the other. And
yeah, and it might come back to bite you. By the way, on the Supreme Court and with the ruling on Roe v. Wade, there's a lot of talk from the left that this court is illegitimate. These people were appointed by Trump, confirmed by the Senate, and they say this is a inside job, inside dealing, all of that stuff. When you start challenging the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, where are we as a republic?
Well, when I grew up in the 1950s in Mississippi, there were billboards everywhere that said, "Impeach Earl Warren." And that was because of Brown versus Board of Education and the desegregation of schools. Segregationists in the South thought that the court was illegitimate and they wanted to throw it out.
So this is not new. This is not
new, but it has come back in a big way. And if you look at opinion polls, which once showed a lot of respect for the overall U.S. government and especially for the Supreme Court, that's just collapsed for everybody. They're in the same boat with used car salesmen.
Okay, Charles.
By the way, I do have a car warranty. An extended car warranty I wanted to talk with you about.
Thank you. I look forward to that. Charles, we've got a couple of minutes left, I think. I'm an eternal optimist. I am definitely.
Me too. Okay. Me too.
What would you say to people who say this country's coming apart at the seams and some people say we're heading for civil war? I mean, they really believe this, that the divisions are so deep that they're unsolvable. What would you say to them?
I would say that we're not headed for a civil war, but we're headed for we are in the midst of a lot of civil dissension. And one of the first duties of government is to protect and defend the population. And the idea that people can riot all over Portland or Minneapolis or any of these other cities and not be subject to the rule of law is a very troubling thing. We just saw in the past week somebody was arrested with 150,000 fentanyl pills and let out immediately, either on bond or personal recognizance. If you're going to have a country where basic rules and processes are not obeyed, then you're going to have more and more incidents like we heard about in the testimony about January 6th, where people arm themselves, they break into our established institutions, they try to override procedures like the counting of electoral votes. We're just in for a world of hurt, and I don't want to see it. I think most Republicans don't want to see it. Most Democrats don't want to see it. And it's important that we have political leaders with a little courage to emphasize that, and that we have voters who do what the voters in San Francisco did, which is throw out people like Chesa Boudin who won't enforce the law.
That's a really interesting take. Charles Lipson, Professor Emeritus, Political Science at University of Chicago. We got to do this again. We could have done it half an hour.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
I really appreciate it. And my producer said, you know what, we're never going to get through all the graphics. And he was right. I was wrong. I own dinner. Thank you, Charles. Great to see you.
Bye-bye.